Foreign Service represents a body that has created a kind of professionalism when it comes to the conduct of American foreign policy. It isn't political. You have people who are in the Foreign Service who can rise up to senior positions within the State Department. They will be ambassadors, they can be in senior positions in the State Department, and they're in those positions whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, whether it's a Republican or Democratic administration, and they create what otherwise would be difficult to create, and we are, I think, much more aware of it now. They create a kind of continuity. You know, it's difficult to see people who will serve in political positions in Republican and Democratic administrations. It wasn't always that way, but more recently that's become the norm. But the Foreign Service has people who basically serve regardless of the administration. From that standpoint, they're apolitical. They constitute a kind of professionalism. And in my experience, though I was not a member of the Foreign Service, in my experience what I was always struck by was a very strong professional ethic, a very strong sense of service to the country, a very strong sense of obligation to do the right thing. And you know, I feel oftentimes like any group that is seen as through a bureaucratic lens, they've been the source of criticism at times, but I think that criticism is largely unwarranted. It's true that others work across administrations, and obviously there's a certain parallelism, particularly to what I would say the military, and to some extent the civil service, which is the same thing. What is different is that the Foreign Service, I think more than the civil service, puts people in more senior positions that have a more immediate direct role on the framing and the making of policy. And I would also say there is one thing about the Foreign Service: you are by law required to serve outside the country. You are by law limited to the amount of time that you can serve within the country. I'm not sure that there's any other service, whether it's the military or the civil service, there's really nothing else quite like that that creates this kind of requirement to be operating, representing the United States, but representing the United States outside of the United States. The State Department is made up of Foreign Service officers, and then there is a civil service. And the State Department itself is organized into regional bureaus and functional bureaus. What I mean by regional is you have a Near East Affairs Bureau, you have a European Affairs Bureau, you have functional bureaus that are the Political Military Bureau, you have the Policy Planning Staff, you will have an Environmental Bureau, you have an Economics Bureau. So you have some bureaus within the State Department that have a functional character, some that have a regional character. Foreign Service officers will be in all of those across the board. It is pretty rare in some of the bureaus, for example, the regional bureaus, you may find a civil servant, but it's pretty rare to find many. I mean, most of the regional bureaus are populated by Foreign Service officers for a very good reason. They're the ones who are serving overseas, so it's not surprising that they're also going to be the ones filling the positions within the regional bureaus. In some of the functional bureaus, you see much more of a civil service representation. Again, it's understandable. Here you're dealing with functional issues that may require a functional expertise. And so that's kind of how I would draw the distinction within the building. Well, I've written a book on statecraft, and I define statecraft as something much broader than diplomacy. Diplomacy is an element of statecraft, but it isn't the sum total of statecraft. Statecraft is how do we take all the instrumentalities that are available to us, military, diplomatic, economic, intelligence, managerial, media, how do we take all of the instrumentalities that are available to us, all of the tools that we have, and how do we have them serve our interests? The essence of good statecraft is you identify clear objectives and then you marry your means to those objectives so that you can achieve the objectives. What you need in the conduct of foreign policy, and therefore in the conduct and fulfillment of statecraft, is a capacity to wield all the instruments that we have available to us. Now those go beyond the State Department, obviously. Those reach into every aspect of the power of the United States government. The real issue in the conduct of statecraft is who do you rely upon to orchestrate and integrate all those instruments into a coherent strategy? Good statecraft depends upon developing strategies that are coherent and that are able to draw on all the means you have available. And typically that falls to, should be the Secretary of State who leads that effort. Oftentimes the Secretary of State, not surprisingly, is going to rely upon, well, who are the people who support Secretary of State? The lion's share of those who do are from the Foreign Service. Well, soft power is an element of statecraft. I mean, clearly you have hard power, you have soft power, you have smart power. There is an element in all the power you exercise that has a coercive side to it. Soft power relies upon what would be all of the built-in advantages the United States has. Our model as a source of attraction, our culture as a source of attraction, our economic advances as a source of attraction, our scientific development as a source of attraction. Soft power is basically what are all of the elements of the United States, excluding hard power, that make the United States an attractive place, that makes the American model one that others might want to emulate. When people want to get visas to come to this country, you'll find more wanting to come here than almost any other place. Well, some of that, no doubt, is driven by a perception of the United States and a perception of American soft power. I would say it's actually instrumental, not because you have to exercise it, but because it has to be there. Coercive diplomacy is typically something that you need to be able to employ if you're going to succeed, and I say that for a reason. Statecraft depends upon, as I said, marrying objectives and means. To succeed in what you want to do, frequently you're trying to get another party to change their behavior. Well, if they're a friend of yours, you can persuade, and maybe it's not that difficult. If they're not a friend of yours, well, then you have to find a way to influence them. You have to find a way to exercise leverage. And you have to find a way to build a set of incentives and sometimes disincentives. So you're getting someone else to do something they didn't intend to do, maybe they didn't want to do. In the end, they decide to do it because they judge that this is better for them than not doing it. Well, we have to orchestrate all the various elements of our toolkit so that, in fact, we can bring that leverage to bear. And coercive diplomacy, the potential threat of the use of force, is something that is useful when you're dealing with adversaries. Most adversaries are not simply going to be persuaded if they think, there is no threat that lies behind what you're doing. Now, obviously, the threat doesn't have to be only the use of force. It can be the use of sanctions. It can be an effort to diplomatically ostracize and isolate. So there are different elements of coercion that don't relate only to force, but they do relate, in a sense, to imposing penalties. And so the key, I think, ultimately to effective statecraft is the capacity to exercise leverage, and that frequently depends upon your ability to bring to bear certain kinds of pressure and certain kinds of coercion. Well, George Kennan was the author of the strategy of containment. And containment, by definition, was a strategy built around how could you contain the Soviet Union. He looked at the Soviet Union as being a country with an ideology that was inherently expansionist and aggressive, but he also felt that the Soviet Union had within it the seeds of its own destruction. So if you could prevent it from expanding, so that it couldn't add to the resources it had, sooner or later the internal contradictions would come to the fore and it would collapse from within. Containment as a strategy was embraced by literally every succeeding administration until the Soviet Union collapsed. As a strategy, it had a number of advantages. One, it was simple to define. And it created an organizing principle around which not only your foreign policy, but to some extent your domestic policy could be geared as well. It created a justification for what should be the way you allocated your resources. And many strategies don't create that kind of a built-in justification, but containment did. Its great strength, in addition, was that you could define success clearly. I mean, one of the problems in exercising statecraft is having objectives that are clear enough that you can carry them out. Oftentimes when statecraft fails, it fails because we have objectives that are not achievable, or we have objectives that are so general as to not be definable or made operational. Containment was something that could be specific. Containment, you could measure how you were doing. So containment as a strategy, and this was something that Kennan developed, was something that was coherent and we were able to exercise effectively. Now, what were its drawbacks? Its drawbacks were, the logic was you applied it everywhere. Well, the problem was not everywhere that the Soviets might be trying to act, it was what they were doing depended upon those in that area who, in a sense, were simply a proxy for the Soviets. Vietnam was carried out because of containment. We saw the expansion of communism. Now, containment, again, given the way it was carried out, in some places it was done expertly, in other places it was too simple an approach, and it ignored that there were basic differences. It ignored the differences between the Soviet Union and China. Had we understood effectively the Sino-Soviet split, the notion that everywhere communism expands is a threat to us would have been viewed differently. Secondly, ignored that there are certain local realities. In Vietnam, yes, you had the Viet Minh who were basically the Viet Minh who take over Vietnam from the French. They were communists, but they were also nationalist. And if you ask yourself the question, what was most important for them? Well, their nationalist identity was most important. It's what created the sense that they would fight any outsiders. It wasn't communism that drove them to fight outsiders. It was their nationalism that drove them to fight outsiders. So the conduct of statecraft requires also the capacity to discriminate and assess. One of the key things, I think, in any strategy, in any statecraft, and this relates specifically to the question of containment, do your assessments spell out a clear picture of what you have to contend with? And is that picture that you have to contend with one that accurately captures the reality that you're then trying to either confront or shape? So there are many successes of containment, and the main successes you find in Europe. And the excesses of containment, where you applied it in areas where it shouldn't have been applied, in Southeast Asia, ended up costing us a great deal. But you'd have to say, to be fair to Kennan, when Kennan defined it, he defined it as being a broad approach. He would himself become a critic of how it was applied, particularly in Southeast Asia, when he said, look, this is not the logic of containment, because this is not the Soviet Union that's expanding. Well, I spent a lot of time negotiating in the Middle East. I first started as an arms control negotiator, but I ended up spending most of my time negotiating in the Middle East. I would say the one agreement that I did exclusively on my own was an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it was called the Hebron Protocol, which involved the Israelis agreeing to redeploy their forces out of Hebron. Now, it was a significant achievement at the time because you had a new Israeli government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who happens still to be the Israeli Prime Minister. The ideology of his party, Likud, rejected the idea that any part of what they call Judea-Samaria or the West Bank should be an area that Israel should somehow withdraw from. And here was Netanyahu had just been elected. Hebron had been a city in the West Bank that, according to an agreement called the interim agreement, the Israelis were to redeploy from, but it was agreed that you would have to still negotiate how to do that. When Netanyahu came in, he said he would fulfill the obligations that he had inherited, but here was Hebron, something that still had to be negotiated, something that to negotiate it meant that you were already violating Likud's ideology, and it took two different 23-day shuttles, basically shuttling around the clock, to complete that agreement. And it involved the Israelis, it involved at the time us taking that city, creating two different sectors for it, working out the terms in which the Israelis would redeploy, creating the circumstances under which the Palestinians would have the authority within Hebron. And it was complicated for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which is the Israelis in one part of the city had a small presence which they wanted to preserve, and the Palestinians wanted this city to be treated like any other city in the West Bank. So negotiating in a way that fit the Israeli requirements and fit the Palestinian requirements was not a simple thing to do, but it also reflected the essence of negotiations or mediation. When you're in a mediation, what you're trying to do is meet the needs of each side, not the wants of each side. Each side comes into a negotiation and they're focused on what they want. And your job as a mediator is to get them off of what they want and onto what they need. And your job as a mediator is to get them to focus on the fact that if they want to get their needs met, they're going to have to understand the other side's needs and find a way to address them. And getting each side to be sensitive to the needs of the other is probably the hardest single task you have as a mediator. When you're dealing with two sides, they always want you to be focused on their needs, not the other side's needs. They're all from what I call the me generation. As soon as you want to start talking about what about the other side, well, the only way you get to the other side is by saying, let's go over your needs again. And then after you go over their needs over and over and over again to prove that as a mediator you understand it, then you focus on, all right, if you want to achieve what's important to you and what you have to have, and that's the difference between a want and a need, something they have to have as opposed to something they would like to have. So you're saying if you want to get what you have to have, they're going to have to get what they have to have. So let's figure out how we're going to do that. And that's, I spent most of my time between Israelis and Palestinians, I would say oftentimes focused on how I could socialize each side to the other side's needs, and that required a major effort because their focus was on their needs. Actually, it's critical. I'll give you what is a very good example that shows how important it can be. One of the major issues I was involved in was in the reunification of Germany within NATO. And this was done in the first Bush administration. I was working with Secretary Baker on this. And we needed to frame this issue publicly in a way that made it understandable within Europe in particular, and especially within Germany. Because the challenge, if unification in Germany was a kind of almost national mission, what we couldn't do is be in a position where unification in Germany was going to take place if it wasn't in NATO. First of all the rest of the Europeans at that time were fearful of a Germany that might be reunited. There was a history here, after all. And Margaret Thatcher at the time said the Germans might achieve in peace what they had failed to achieve in war. This is a NATO ally member who's looking at the possibility of unification that way. We put a premium very early on, in a sense, identifying publicly the key principles that ought to guide the diplomacy. Now, the reason for doing that in public was to create a kind of momentum behind what everybody would understand. We needed to ensure that there was kind of one common frame that everyone could relate to, and if we didn't define it up front, it wouldn't happen. And now, it was key to our diplomacy, but it was done in public, it wasn't private. When you ask the question about public diplomacy, sometimes you think about, well, how do we sell something, or how do we sustain something? And that's true. Sometimes you're talking about, how do I ensure that I create an environment that everyone else will respond to? Public diplomacy is frequently important precisely because, not because you're selling an outcome, but because you're shaping an environment that everyone will get used to. And if in fact you're trying to achieve something that in a sense is not expected, and German unification in NATO was something that if you had canvassed almost all of what I call the cognoscenti here in this country at the beginning of that process, they would have said, well, you're never going to get a unified Germany in NATO because that'll look like a win for us and a defeat for the Soviet Union. And you've got Europeans who are uneasy about it. We used Germany in NATO as a way of saying, look, this is going to be a European Germany, it's not going to be a German Europe. And with the Soviets, we did this to create a sense that, look, there's a train that's moving that you can't stop, but at the same time, we focused very heavily on what is it you are going to need to be able to show this wasn't imposed on you? What changes are you going to need in NATO to show that, in a sense, this isn't such a loss for you, that in fact you've been able to shape an outcome and you've been able to ensure that the nature of that outcome isn't a threat to the Soviet Union? Well, I think in climate change, and what I would say, not just in the Montreal Protocol, but I would say in general, when you're talking about transnational issues are these that are basically, they respect no border. Climate change is one that is obvious in this regard. The Foreign Service, I think, played a pivotal role early on in terms of, again, helping to frame what the issue was going to be. helping to define, right, who are our logical partners here, and who are the key challenges that we're going to face, and how do we maximize our influence, our leverage by drawing on others? I mean, there has to be a division of labor here, and how do we go about doing that? And I think one of the things that people who have grown up through the Foreign Service, because the Foreign Service seeks to promote generalists, not specialists only in one region, as an example. Even though I said you will find Foreign Service people populating the regional bureaus, but oftentimes they're asked to move from one bureau to another. You know, they will learn multiple languages, and the purpose is to be a generalist more than a specialist. And the idea here is that you can work across different regional areas, you can work internationally, and you can do it in a way that makes it natural for you to partner with lots of different places around the globe, and obviously lots of different partners. And I think it makes it natural for a multilateral negotiation. People in the Foreign Service who have this kind of facility because they have worked in lots of different places, for them it comes kind of naturally. And so I would say, you know, here, when it comes to climate change, this was a natural one for the Foreign Service. Although, again, not in the place of what is the political leadership, because oftentimes you'll have political appointees who come in with a particular expertise. So the people who drove a lot of this were the people, by the way, who, in a sense, had been immersed in the issue of environment and the consequences of climate change and the implications of warming and so forth. Now, oftentimes they then will help to educate Foreign Service people who have more limited background, but then they want to draw upon their facility to help negotiate or to orchestrate the diplomacy. Well, it complicates it, but in some ways, while it complicates it, it also creates a very clear common threat. When you try to build a coalition, it's a lot easier to build that coalition if the threat that you're trying to build it around is crystal clear. If it's not us selling the threat, if the threat, in a sense, sells itself, if it's obvious, then it's easier to build a coalition. I mean, I wouldn't say we have a coalition fighting ISIS where everybody in the coalition actually sees himself as being part of the coalition. And I wouldn't say that everybody who's part of this basically necessarily sees those who might be working in parallel, even if they're not, excuse me, if they're not in the coalition, as being an alliance partner. Saudi Arabia and Iran are competitors in the region. The Saudis look at Iran through a very hostile lens. They see them as a threat. They see them as trying to encircle them. And yet both are fighting ISIS right now. Now, it isn't because we're coordinating between the two. We're probably deconflicting between the two. But here's a case where a common threat is producing at least parallel actions. Sometimes you can build what I'll call a positive coalition where everyone is integrated and you create what is a coordinated division of labor approach. Sometimes you're facing an enemy, you know, you can't create that kind of integration, but what you can create is parallelism, where the parallelism is still additive. What each side is doing, you know, on its own doesn't mean as much as what they're each doing at the same time. So I think, again, you know, you want to be creative when you face a non-state actor because you're facing a different kind of challenge. And it's different also in another respect because non-state actors typically embed themselves in civilian populations. If you're going to bomb them, almost inevitably, you know, it sounds, the term collateral damage, I've never liked the term collateral damage. It's antiseptic. It's like, all right, you end up killing people who are not combatants, who are not fighters, and you say, oh, we had collateral damage, as if somehow that makes it less egregious. But the fact is, when you deal with non-state actors who embed themselves in civilian populations, they change the nature of warfare. By the way, that also puts a higher premium on the question of public diplomacy because you have to explain what you're doing and you have to do it in a compelling way. So they create different kinds of challenges, obviously of a qualitatively different nature, and yet, you know, because they represent a threat that is so clear, sometimes it makes it easier to mobilize the kind of support that otherwise you wouldn't find so easy to develop. I mean, look, the President has said our aim is to degrade, and he said ultimately destroy. To destroy enemy is almost impossible because you're destroying an idea, so you can't simply defeat it by force. You're going to have to defeat it by another idea, or you're going to have to discredit the idea altogether. That's not a containment strategy. That's really a rollback strategy. But containment would be made easier. The more pronounced the threat, the easier it is to develop the kind of support to contain a threat. Now, again, containment can be a precursor to rolling back. When the Eisenhower administration came in after the Truman administration, they said they were going to have a rollback strategy. In truth, they had a containment strategy because rollback was a lot harder. Rollback is much more aggressive. Rollback imposes greater risks. Same thing here. If we are serious about a rollback strategy, a strategy that degrades and ultimately destroys, defeats, that's going to require a defeat. You cannot defeat this kind of a threat from the air. It takes ground forces. Now, the administration's approach is to say, well, the ground forces will be the local forces. Well, that's easier to say than to do because in the case of Iraq, those forces are not in a position to do that at this stage. So it takes time to develop them, to train them, for them to, in a sense, be able to operate. A lot of this requires the kind of urban warfare that they haven't been trained to do. I mean, if you go back when we were on the ground in Iraq, it was U.S. forces that were going into Fallujah and going into Ramadi. The Iraqi forces we trained, they might be with us, but they never took the lead on this. Now they would have to take the lead, and in circumstances after which they had collapsed, the military had collapsed. So it'll take some time, but your question about containment is, it's easier to, in a sense, justify why you have to carry on this fight. In the first instance, containment is probably the first approach. It's not the last one. The way you succeed at not having to use force is oftentimes being in a position where everyone believes you are prepared to use it and they don't doubt that. So long as they doubt that you will use it, the chances that you'll have to go up. I think in this particular case, in the case of something like ISIS, because this is an idea, one way you discredit the idea is to discredit the claims. Their claim is they're on a divine mission. So some of that requires demonstrating they're not on a divine mission. If they're on a divine mission, they wouldn't be defeated. They wouldn't suffer military losses. If they were on a divine mission, you wouldn't see some of their forces surrendering. Those who are on a divine mission are true believers and they wouldn't surrender. So if you can begin to show pictures in the cases of where the Kurds have rolled them back in some places, and they've actually taken ISIS prisoners, there should be pictures taken showing these forces surrendering. It will be a very effective public diplomacy tool to demonstrate that they're not on a defined mission. There's nothing divine about them. The more you can discredit them, the less you have to fight them, because the less they're going to be able to recruit others. The challenge we face with them now is that they have money, we're trying to choke off their money. They have an appeal because it looks like they represent a certain purity, and they've been successful. Look, they have taken over a wide swath of territory of Syria and Iraq. And we've only rolled them back, this coalition has only rolled them back in about 2% of the territory that they took. So to defeat them, you're going to have to see more of a rollback. But once they start suffering defeats, then how we can present that publicly will aid us in terms of reducing the need to actually have to fight them, or at least it reduces the need to deal with a group that continues to grow. We need to cut off their flow of new fighters. Now, part of that is by ensuring there isn't the same sense of a target. One of the reasons you have ISIS develop is because of Assad in Syria, and the image that he was carrying an all-out brutal war against the Sunnis. And here becomes ISIS, they're the defender of the Sunnis. Well, we have to show they're not the defenders of the Sunnis. We have to show that, in fact, the reason they're there in the first place is also disappearing. I'll surprise you with the answer. When you negotiate the way I did, it's a kind of a completely intense effort. But you don't do it alone, you do it with a small team of people. And in some ways, it's the spirit of working with a small team that is something that it creates such a strong bond between people, and it creates such a strong sense of mission that in life you don't always have that kind of a strong mission. And so one of my fondest memories are some of the negotiating efforts, as hard as it was, the way we would work things through, and we would work it through as a group. And for me, I think that counts as much as anything. I think if you go back and you look at, Henry Kissinger is the one who is most responsible for creating the opening to China. And here I think his awareness of history, his acute sense of geopolitical realities, his understanding of what were Chinese needs and interests, created the potential for the opening. There's a difference between creating a diplomatic opening and then building a relationship. Now, we still have a competitive relationship with China today because there are profound differences between us. On the other hand, China itself has moved a long ways. There's still a cultural difference between us, but the kind of their interest in a certain kind of shape to international rules of the road were, I think, heavily influenced by the diplomacy that created the opening between us. Does that overcome all the gaps? Obviously not, because there's a competitive character to what is a relationship, but it allows you to manage the relationship. It doesn't mean you're overcoming the gaps between us culturally. It doesn't mean that somehow, we're going to be overly similar. It just means that you begin to create a pathway of commonality. And the essence of good diplomacy is, how do you build on what you have in common, and how do you shrink what you have that's different? Alliance management is very different than bilateral relations, because alliance management means that you're dealing with multiple countries at the same time. NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance is an alliance of democracies, so we have a lot in common, obviously. But within the different countries of NATO, there obviously are differences, and managing those differences is actually one of the bigger challenges. The economic differences are reflected in NATO more in terms of different countries' readiness to modernize their forces, and the domestic politics either allow that or limit the scope of what can be spent on defense. We found also in Afghanistan that some of the NATO members carved out exceptions for themselves, that there were certain kinds of combat, certain kinds of roles they simply wouldn't play. Well, those on our side who were charged with the task of having to negotiate how we were going to approach the allied mission in NATO had to figure out a way to manage that. That wasn't a simple thing, but it was done, and it obviously took account of which countries were capable of doing which missions, and could we get those who weren't prepared to play an active combat role, could we have them compensate for that by doing other things in training, or providing more police assistance, or providing more material assistance. So, that was I think a real challenge for those who were responsible for carrying out this mission.